Thank you so much for being here. My name is Bjeldbak, and over the next 25 minutes, I'll try to trace as best as we can a lineage sculptural thought in body transformation across a century. From art to a brief look at Louise and against Koshnikov and into practices of contemporary artists such as Marguerite Humour, Ivana Basic, and Isabella Andreas. Together, I'll argue, they form a genealogy of living form. A line of artists who radicalize earlier legacies by merging the organic and synthetic, the human, modern human, dissolving the boundaries between animate and inanimate, body and environment. I feel quite certain it wouldn't have been the same today without art's example. But before tracing his influence forward, I would like to briefly outline 4 key aspects of his pioneering contribution to modern sculpture: his relationship to nature, his process and material thinking, his haptic approach, and his subversion of sculptural conventions. Distilling his contribution into these 4 principles allows us to carry them forward as a lens, as a framework that will help us to see how later artists transformed his ideas. So please bear with me if some of these initial ideas are already familiar to you. This illusion by the destructiveness of the First World War, art rejected traditional representational approaches to art, especially art that sought to imitate nature's appearance and instead search for creative strategies analogous to natural processes such as growth, metamorphosis, gravity, and chance. He conceived his work as part of the living continuum, not as something separate from the world around it. In his own words, art is a truth that grows in man like a fruit from a plant or a child in his mother's womb. What mattered to him was not so much resemblance, but belonging. He wanted to make forms that stand on equal footing with nature's own productions, to produce new rather than to reproduce. The second aspect is art's sculptural formal language, that is organic and biomorphic, a vocabulary of rounded curving forms that drift fluidly between abstract and figuration, striking a balance between this and illusion. Many carry associations with natural and living forms, bodies, stones, pebbles, clouds, leaves, each implying motion, evolution, and variation. Art's inverted works might even have been inspired by this non-fixed orientation of these natural elements. A cone, for instance, can be equally enjoyed from all sides. Also, many have spoken about the vitality of the works. Critics such as Herbert Reed spoke of the soft pulse that seemed to beat from within the sculptures, almost like living beings in constant flux, while sculptor Barbara Hepworth of the Visiting Art Studio in 1932 remarked that he was giving life and vitality to the material itself. Around that period, when art first began making his sculptures, there was a strong desire for a living art, an examination of life's forms, while also the life of forms. And art sculptural practice, I believe, gave that notion one of its most literal and tactile expressions. It's crucial also to see how art believes that forms emerge through making. He famously described how his works came into being. This is the mystery. My hands talk to themselves. The dialogue is established between the plaster and them, as if I'm absent, as if I'm not necessary. The forms are born, amicable and strange, that order themselves without me. I notice them, as sometimes one notices human figures and clouds. For art, form was discovered through touch and through chance, not predetermined by sketch or models. He often began working directly in plaster, a shape-shifting material, treating it not as a step towards something else, but as a thinking, evolving medium, a living archive of ideas, so to speak. He even revisited motifs across decades, rescaling and rematerializing them, allowing form to evolve through repetition and variations. This iterative metamorphosis mirror processes of organic growth. Even his concern with patina and surface reflected an embrace of natural change. He wanted monsters to exercise with the river. He wanted classes starting staying the time, rejecting the freezing and idealizing of them. The third aspect is the haptic dimension of house practice. Touch was central to him, both in making and in viewing. As Harry Hartog noted in the 2012 catalog resume of art sculpture, our work can really low table, relying on his hands as much as on his vision, modeling by feel, sometimes outdoors, surrounded by what inspired him, the natural world. In this photo, also by Albert Eugene Gallatin, we can observe how, with his sculpture in his lap, his fingers covered in plastic from the making, the tips just slightly grazing the plastic surface. And Katrin Pratt described it beautifully in her publication that it seems like art is establishing a connection with the form. Many of the plasters and the bronzes as well sort of preserve these physical traces, full marks, finger impressions, seams of modeling, that sort of retains the tactile immediacy of touch in the form. This haptic awareness also extended beyond art studio practice. He also invited visitors to touch the works, believing that only through touch could one really sense the sculpture's subtle modulations. As Marxist Molinsky observes, such gestures destabilize the normative vision-based frame of art reception, encouraging new modes of perception, intimacy, and inquiries into what kind of experience art would actually make possible. The approach even entered an institutional context. In 1957, at Interbaum Berlin, visitors were invited to handle Arp's bronze mirror. And also at the Haas-Minter Museum in 1968, there was an exhibition organized for visually impaired, where visitors were allowed to touch without gloves the scanning the horizon plaster to get a sense of the material and the shape of the work. In that way, we can say that Arp's notion of touch or form was studied. It was the artist's hand in shaping matter and the viewer's hand in discovering or rediscovering the vitality of the work through contact. The fourth principle I call subversion, because Arp kept challenging sculptural conventions over and again. He dismissed pedestals often as useless crutches, often letting his work rest, for instance, in the grass, on tables, and domestic spaces situated within the world instead of above it. He also undermined the expectation of permanence. His sculptures, sometimes made from fragile materials as plaster, that he also reused, reworked, and recombined into new forms, sometimes decades apart, rather than fixing them as finished pieces. Some pieces expanding also on the tactile aspects of his practice, such as sculpture to be lost in forest, and multiple work that even propose a return to nature, inviting the viewer to rearrange parts of it to complete it, and as the title suggests, maybe eventually let them vanish among the trees. As Arp himself wrote, he really wanted his work to find its humble, anonymous place in woods, in the mountains, in nature. Through these gestures, dispensing the materials, privileging the process of the project, accepting the chance, Arp profoundly shifted what sculpture could be. Not a monument to mastery, but a living organism subject to change, environment, and touch. So if we keep these four principles, nature, process, and subversion in mind, we can more easily see how the seeds that Arp planted then blossom decades later, for instance, in the practices of Louise and Louise and the contemporary sculptors working today. If we have a look quickly at the mid-20th century, we could, of course, chart continuities with Barbara Hellberg and Henry Moore, but instead of we focus on two artists who mutate Arp's legacy in decisive and revealing ways. Louise and Alina Sapochnikov, whose work both serve as essential bridges for understanding his influence on contemporary arts. If we look first at Alina Sapochnikov, who was part of the Polish avant-garde, she created these human landscapes She stressed herself that she was deeply indebted to nature and described her approach as wholly biological. And the intimate relationship between human and nature in love is also very clear when looking at the work. But also with particular bodies are being absorbed by landscape or emerging from them, that still remains rather ambiguous in the work. So this is beautiful. Like art, she invested in metamorphosis, but in the transformation that she emphasized, she also looked at the fragility and the decay on things that melt, dissolve, disintegrates, rather than solely on how they grow. She also extended her material experimentation, and with new polymers, especially the flexible polyester resins, available to her, she continued explorations of repetitions, of passing seriality, as a challenge to classical hierarchies of materials and the ideas of original artwork through reworkings as initially explored by art. And also like art, she was drawn to tactile engagement, allowing the visitors to touch the work. For instance, rearranging movable parts in works like Game of Ground Pebbles from 1967. If we move on to Louise Bourgeois, we also see in works like this one, Sleep 2, that she made in Italy, that she experimented with organic and biomorphic shapes. But she did so also from a psychological and emotional perspective. She was very open about when she was writing creations. And she also continued to advance their material experiments using unconventional, even perishable materials. Latex, as we see here, fabric, rubber, aware that they would sap, they would breathe, that they would age. She there blurred the line between abstract and figuration, like art, also reusing and transforming her own imagery. For instance, Sleep, that was on the previous slide, that originated from Compass that we see here on this slide. In her moment retrospective, a curator said about her works that the consideration of the individual, the group, and the correspondence between all living beings is the foundation of meaning throughout bourgeois sculpture. And this very much resonates with the ideas in art practice. And like art, both Sapochnikov and bourgeois works also exude this immense inner life, a kind of indwelling energy, I think, that seems to move beneath the surface of all of the works. And I will also see in the contemporary sculptor's practices. And also we can look into what Bourgeois said about the making of the works, how they came about. Said that I allow myself to follow blindly the images that suggest themselves to me. Again, echoing after here of how forms reveal themselves to the artist. One can argue that Bourgeois expands art's biomorphism into psychological, cultural, and feminist registers. It's also formative in environmental integration, placing the works like organisms in relations to each other, suspending them like nests, like we see here. These have even been installed in trees outdoors. And sometimes she also situated the works outdoors, like Art did in his garden in France. Or when he left works around on his walks in the forest with his friend Camille. So we can say that he pedestalized the sculptures and experimented with organic flexible placement of the work in the studio and in his garden, which was popular exhibition room with an ecosystem almost reforms that seems to inspire also so many installations of sculpture today. So where art planted the seed of living forms, Bourgeois and Sapochnikov deeply influenced, allowed them to mutate, and these developments together allow to continue to shape the powerful strain of contemporary sculpture. So if we turn our lens to the present, we can see how several artists in different ways continue to radicalize this lineage just described. In their practices, we can see how absurdity of nature, process, touch, and subversion have found renewed relevance in an age shaped by new material and ecological awareness. So if we start with the French artist, Marguerite Grimaud, Like art, she finds inspiration in nature, but she finds it particularly in new social insects such as ants and bees, collective species that build and sustain ecosystems. She takes these forms models for cooperation, interdependence, and symbiosis, but she also does not imitate them. She creates new worlds. Like art, she begins not from representation but from generation, forms that seem to grow of their own thoughts. Her formal language is biomorphic and fluid, full of wibbly and flowing transitions that appear in constant states of flux. For instance, in this work, the forager for honey, natural states of flux and change are implied not only by the forms, but also by the suggestion of growth, by replication and division, and by the impression that one part might be generating and nourishing the next one, as fungi flourishes from rotting root, in other words. Also, the viewer's perspective is often unstable in her works. A form can look one way from one side and completely different from another. We can argue that this is art's perceptual instability updated, an insistence on the necessity of sort of moving around works to fully understand their shape. Think, for instance, of this work by now, Human Lunar Spectral, that appears almost like a fleshy torso from one side and an abstract swirl from another. And then we can see how it's replayed today in this work, The Riddle of Final Beasts, a sort of morphing silhouette from 2017. She works with both organic and synthetic materials, mixing, for instance, beeswax, amberglass, chemically tinted resins, and even the carpet that we see here is dyed with liquid human, which is a mixture of the body's chemical elements that has then given this beautiful, not very natural looking pink color that we see on the top in the image. But working with living materials that will change, incorporating also smell, for instance, from the honeycombs in the experience, activating more senses than apps just vision and touch. She also speaks of skins, the surface that acts as a living interface, like a sort of membrane, echoing again our attention to the surface and his refusal of high gloss in favor of surfaces that carry the perception of the form forth instead. Like art, she's also attuned to touch. Humor sometimes invites viewers to recline on works, such as this work, Fallen Leaf, to feel their contours physically, rocking gently, feeling them with our whole bodies as we lie down, experiencing both the works and the surroundings in another way. The work has rounded shapes and curvy lines, as you see here. And as Gaston Bachelard wrote, everything oval and round a breast touch and demand to be caressed. And humor, like art, literalizes that pull in her work. She also often displays works resting, leaning, or even fully integrating this into the space without the crutch of pedestals or other aids of display. And the viewers must move with them, activating them through motion and encounter. So we can say that Humeau's practice can be seen as extending art's biomorphism into the post-biological realm, where art's model is formed from organic growth. Humeau sort of engineers hybrid organisms that speculate on future ecologies, taking our current situation as a point of departure. Another practice that we can examine through the lens of art's legacy is Ivana Basic, a Serbian artist who grew up in the war-torn Yugoslavia. Basic carries out exploration of metamorphosis into a terrain of vulnerability and of trauma. Her works dwell on becoming and unbecoming, forms in transition, often armored or cocooned. So where art often associated metamorphosis with growth, Basic, like Sapochnikov, includes decay and decline as stages of change. speaking directly to our era's precarities as well. Her work revolves around metamorphosis under duress, I would say, looking at transformation and dissolution, exploring the ability to change without being destroyed. Inspired by Catherine Malabou's anthology of the accidents, she connects the natural and the psychological in her work. Then very much like bourgeois, drawing out all the legacies that led up to today. Her forms appears, I would say, at once otherworldly and natural, between human and modern human, material, immaterial, natural, technological, between creation and also destruction. The sculptures, she says herself, are always in transition from one state to another. She speaks of the forms emerging through dialogue. She says, I'm guided, I'm channeling, the forms emerge. A statement that again almost echoes both Arp's and Bourgeois' descriptions of the emergence of their forms. The materials combine fragility with hardness. Wax, glass, metal, stone, and dust, and even immaterial elements like breath, force, pressure. For basic, breath is central as it connects to life. And glass, she says, always represent breath because it's formed through the force of breath. For the body, breathing is slow, a degrading process. It disappears as soon as it's drawn, and yet it is life-giving. As Arp left fingerprints in plaster, basic leaves her breath within glass, a sort of poetic parallel. When talking about touch, I also don't think it's only about how their touch shaped the works, how we are allowed to touch them, but also how they are touching us. Basic also matches materials with conceptual counterparts, so the semantic role shift. Steel becomes bone, stone passes as flesh, and this process of transubstantiation sort of becomes another way of evoking nature and natural processes in works. Basic is interested in the materials' transformative qualities also, and notes that, for instance, the glass and wax seem fragile when solid, but that they're nearly indestructible in liquid form. That the works sort of become choreographies at different stages, and she thus extends into experimentation even further. Finally, the top. Let's turn to the Dutch artist, Isabelle Andreas. Her sculpture sort of operates as living systems, chemicals and material processes that evolve over time, reacting to natural elements such as humidity, temperature, and light. She finds her inspiration in nature and natural processes, like the other artists, and is interested in what happens when different components interact with each other, how they evolve, much like Arp's fascination with metamorphosis. She's the artist permanentist representation whose work is formally the furthest removed from Arp's, yet whom I believe we can still sort of describe as working in an organic and biomorphic and distinctly metamorphic mode. In her works, we're not quite sure if they're coming alive or if they're just about to decay. And like Arp's forms, which she continually reworked and reassembled, as we know, with her, none of the transmutations are ever definite. Her works likewise resist this census. So modified repetition and the absence of underlying permanence are key takeaways when considering these contemporary artists. So Andreas' work unfolds slowly, performing their own transformation. Her sculptures grow, they crystallize, they mutate, no say mention is final. She makes visible the slow metabolism of materials that are only metaphorically evolved. Some changes over a month, others over years, blurring the line between also sculpture and performance. Challenging both sculptural and performative conventions all at once, giving agency to the material. She calls the materials queer because they resist fixity and categorization. By choreographing transformations she cannot fully control herself, she reinstates also chance and material agency as collaborators, one of Ab's radical lessons. Before his experiments, artists had generally aimed for a more skilled level of control. So across these practices, I would say I would argue runs a shared preoccupation with metamorphosis, permeability, and material agency. What Ab once approached as an abstraction of nature has become philosophical ideology, one where matters also thinks, feels, and evolves. Often resting low on the ground, Andreas' work also inhabits space like organisms rather than occupying them like objects. So if Ab dreamed of returning sculptures to the forest and was interested in nature's effect on his works, as we see here, where we see the oxidation of the metal, Andreas brings the forest processes into the museum, letting entropy and change unfold before our eyes. And in doing so, she takes Ab's call for sculpture to find a space in nature and reconfigures it within the museum itself, allowing nature's temporality to sort of infiltrate the institution. She thus pushes his metamorphic logic even further into the Anthropocene, where materials don't just signify life, they also behave. So, other artists I would love to explore in more details, but we'll only have time to briefly introduce further to demonstrate how fertile the ground is for developing this line of thought around legacy. One is the Russian artist Maria Kushinkova, who uses these molten glass works as a living medium to create organic, often anthropomorphic sculptures that can be tossed and reoriented, recalling Ab's invertible works, and with a great inner life force. As one critic said, you almost have to be coated with Teflon to not be able to feel them. Another is Mira Lee from South Korea, who sort of extends the biomorphism into a technological realm, creating motorized, mutable ecosystems of fluids and silicone that tremble, drip, breathe, thereby foregrounding effect, decay, and continual becoming or unbecoming. The transformation and metamorphosis physically breaking free in the sculptural form. Finally, I would love to talk more about Klara Husmanlova, a Czech artist who she worked and approached sculpture as living form, nature, and metamorphosis. But not only is this visible in the formal language, but also through her activation, where she's integrating performance and crafted environments where materials and bodies transform together. And over time across the exhibition. And she even made art inspired by. Yes. But a few reflections before we round off. Contemporary artists really work in very different conditions, new technologies, new media, and unfolding climate emergency and changing world. Like art, they're responding to crisis, rethinking the relationship between art, matter, and life. Art drank of a fusion of human nature and object, a restoration of the great harmonic oneness of all that lives, grows, and is. Today's artists extend the dream by acknowledging interdependence and entanglement, dissolving the dualism between nature and technology, human and modern human. And if art imagined the companionship with the modern human, contemporary sculpture tests how that companionship acts, how materials perform, system response, and form refuse permanence in favor of sequence, stage, and transformation. In conclusion, what art initiated through his biomorphic language was thus not merely a modern vocabulary, but also, I argue, a mode of thinking, one that places form within a continuum of life. Across the last century, sculpture has really continued to pulse with life, with that life. From Ab's concretions to humoral skins, basic breath, Andreas' chemical ecologies, sculpture remains a living language, one that grows, that mutates, that evolves, invites us to sense our place within the shared material world. Ab's influence, then, might well operate less as a direct historical lineage than as a living method, an to transformation, touch, material vitality that continue to shape ethics and aesthetics of contemporary sculpture. And it's interesting even to ponder about how art's work might have evolved facing the situation we're in today. So, thank you so much for listening. I really regret not being in New York today, but I will be very glad to continue the conversation and take your questions by either email or phone. Thank you.